Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Grosse Pointe Historical Society History Center. We are so pleased with this brand new building. You know, we already own and burned the mortgage across the street at the Provençal Warehouse. And as immediate past president, on behalf of our new president, Stuart Grigg, we welcome you here to our state-of-the-art center to preserve Grosse Pointe history. We are so grateful to Chairman Jim Verney for becoming friends of the Grosse Pointe Historical Society. We invite you and implore you to become a member. We respect Katie Doelle's expertise. She's interviewed me at my house, which is the second oldest home in the Grosse Pointe, the Cadieux Farmhouse. So the new gravestones are across the street. After the lecture, if you walk around the house, you'll be able to view those. It's not too dark. And come anytime and see us. I do want to say, Candy Sweeney, could you come up? Just a moment. Candy is our landscape architect, and she did the work here. She donated her expertise. And same thing across the street. So we would like to honor you with a lifetime membership to the Grosse Pointe Historical Society. Enjoy, and thanks you two. Take it away.
Ready? Okay. Welcome, my name is Katie Doelle. Firstly, I would like to thank you for all coming tonight for the fourth presentation of the Higby Maxinagny Lecture Series in conjunction with the Grosse Pointe Public Library. Secondly, a big thank you to the Grosse Pointe Historical Society for inviting us to present at their wonderful new History Centre. Finally, I would like to introduce you to Jim Verney and thank him for joining us. Jim was born in Grosse Pointe and is a descendant of the Vernier family. Together, we will be telling the story and the history of the Vernier family and St. Paul's Cemetery. The following presentation will be in 3 parts and will focus on the story of Jean-Baptiste and Catherine Vernier. The couple played a pivotal role in the history of the Vernier family. Not only did they establish a life for themselves in Grosse Pointe, they also laid the foundation for the family to become important members of the community for centuries to come. Today, the couple are laid to rest in St. Paul's Cemetery, a tranquil place steeped in history. The past 3 years has been the focus of an ongoing research project that has presented many answers, highlighted countless questions, and introduced new friends. It has focused on the heritage of a long line of Verniers in Grosse Pointe, who are representatives of one of the oldest families in southeastern Michigan. The project not only culminated in the replacement of the couple's headstones in St. Paul's Cemetery, but has helped preserve the history of the family for generations to come, honouring, remembering, and celebrating the legacy of the Vernier family. And this is their story. So let's start with part 1, the Vernier family. The origin of the Vernier name can be traced to Grenoble in France, a city in the southeast of the country at the foot of the French Alps. In France, Vernier is a topographic name for someone who lives near an alder tree. Over the years, the Vernier family in southeastern Michigan has been changed and adapted. The variations began when Jean-Baptiste's youngest daughter, Apolline, married Francis van Antwerp, and together they had 4 children. It is reported the family branches then became Vernier, Ladecour, La Douceur, and La Ducrie, and I apologise for my French accent. I'm trying my best with the names. In 1890, Charles Francis Vernier adapted the name from Vernier to become Verney, possibly for business reasons or because of the persecution of the French and Catholics. Verney is an English family name that can be traced back at least 8 centuries. Jim, would you like to say a bit more?
Yes, please. Thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to find out how many of my family members, 1 generation, 2 generations, 3 generations. Oh, we have somebody here that's 9 generations. So could we have anybody that's even remotely associated with the Verniers? Please stand up, please. Holy moly. We have a rich family history, and that's what we want to share with you tonight. And as some of you know, I had the privilege, I don't know why, I didn't have any decision in it, but back in 1952, September 18th, 1952, I was born in Grosse Pointe Farms in Grace Cottage Hospital right down the street. So 1 mile down the street, I was born, and here I am at age 71, back to my roots. And I'm excited about that and glad to be able to present the family to you. First question I have for tonight is on pronunciation. How do you pronounce that name? There's a road that 8 Mile goes into a street in Grosse Pointe. How do you pronounce that? Anybody want to give it a shot?
Vernier.
Is it Vernier? Some say Vernier. Some say Verney with an IE. Some say Vernier with IA. And as you'll find as we go through our presentation, that the son of John Baptiste and Catherine, Antoine Vernier, when the census came in 1860, he was in a township called Erin Township. Of course, all of you historians know that it was Orange Township at one time. And then after 13 years, there were so many Irish in the 1850s that came to this area that they changed it to Erin Township. And then henceforth became St. Clair Shores and part of Warren in that area there. But Antoine's name on the census and on the map we have for Erin Township is spelled Vernia. And Antoine is not Antone, but even sort of morphed into the public records as Antoyne. And of course, when they anglicized it, they called him Anthony. So it's interesting how the name has changed through the year, through the interpretations, and especially as getting into genealogy, you see that happen a lot. I wanted to speak a second about the locations that the family was at. As Katie had said, they started in Grenoble, France. And of course, those of you that were around in 1968 might remember Grenoble, France for another reason. Jean-Claude Killet. And the 1968 Winter Olympics. So Don Greenwell and Bob Weiner and I were juniors at Detroit Catholic Central, and so we followed the Winter Olympics from Grenoble. And little did I know that I had roots in Grenoble. It's also known as the capital of the Alps. So very mountainous area, except for the city itself. John Baptiste father has the same name, John Baptiste Vernier Ladoucière numero uno. And so the subject of tonight's presentation is on number 2, who is obviously in the Grosse Pointe area. So the grandfather of John Baptiste never left Grenoble to come to North America, but his son, Lawrence, made the trek from Grenoble to the Maury Isle. Montreal, in the St. Laurent section of Montreal. And that's the connection coming from France to Canada. And they had a son there, and the son being in 1762, John Baptiste Vernier, Ladouceur, numero two. And so people have asked me, why did he make the move from Montreal to Detroit? And the reason he made the obvious answer to that is opportunity, that he saw the opportunity in this expanding western part of the country, which was the greater Detroit area. And so he came to Detroit, and as Katie said, he married Catherine in 1790 at St. Anne's de Detroit, which is now a minor basilica in the Catholic Church. This factoid, my family jokes when I talk about factoids, but I have a factoid, and I'm a population kind of guy, so I like that kind of stuff. Could somebody guess, in the Detroit area in 1775, how many people were in the Detroit area, not including Native American Indians? Does anybody have a guess? 2,000? 600. Let's try one more, and then we'll go to the answer. So we had 600, we had 2,000. This is the greater Detroit area. Now bear in mind, we're speaking of River Rouge through St. Clair Shores. Somebody said 10,000, somebody said 50. Well, here's the answer. It was given to us by Henry Hamilton. Of course, many of you may not recall Henry Hamilton, but he was the British general that was responsible for Detroit from 1775 to 1779. And his first job in 1775 was to do a census. And in the census, he found the following information. 1,357 people lived in the Detroit area, again, stretching from River Rouge to St. Clair Shores. How many people lived in the fort or the stockade? 222. 475 lived downriver, and as you know, the French ribbon farms went to the north towards us in Grosse Pointe Farms and into St. Clair Shores. Then, of course, they also went south. And so south of Detroit, there were 475 people. But in the upriver area, it was 675. And so 675 people going from what is now downtown Detroit to St. Clair Shores. And they were in ribbon farms. And as we know, we have the Tremblays and the Rivards and the Boubains and on and on and on. Another arm of my family is the St. Aubin family. And they had not one, not two, not three, but 4 ribbon farms. And so the ribbon farms are all up this area. But if you take 655 people from Detroit to St. Clair Shores, that's not a whole lot of density. So the families were French ribbon farm families, and they had to have big families. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. And yes, for you trivia buffs, this will be great when you go to a cocktail party during the holidays. If someone asks you the question, how many people lived on Hog Island? And Belle Isle? How many lived on Belle Isle in 1775? The number is 5. So that's not including the hogs that were in that particular area. So with that, we'll turn it back over to Katie.
So let's start from the beginning. On July 24th, 1701, Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac, accompanied by approximately 100 fellow Frenchmen and an additional 100 Algonquin Indians, established Fort Pontchartrain de Detroit, the location of downtown Detroit today. From that moment through to 1796, 3 flags have flown over the city. The first was the French, then the British, followed by the United States in 1796. Many French families arrived in the region in the early 1700s, including descendants of the Vernier family, who not only became an integral part of the history of Grosse Pointe, but of southeastern Michigan. The family also had a large presence in Saginaw and Bay counties. After the French surrendered Detroit to the British around 1760, under the new flag, many of the early French settlers left the city and moved to Grosse Pointe to join the large French contingent that had made the area their home. Most of the French families in Grosse Pointe occupied farmland. At the time, the area was heavily wooded and swampy. However, it proved to be a great location for farming. Many of the early French ribbon farms had around 300 feet of water frontage and ran at least a mile inland. The farms were owned by some of the area's most prominent French families, including Rivard, Renault, Cadieux, Tremblay, Poupard, and Vernier. Jean-Baptiste Vernier and Catherine played a pivotal role in the history of the Vernier family. Jean-Baptiste Vernier de la Cour was born on November 15th, 1762, in Saint-Laurent in Montreal. His father, Laurent, was one of the earliest members of the Vernier family to relocate to North America. It is believed Jean-Baptiste arrived in the United States in the late 1700s and eventually made his home in Grosse Pointe. Catherine L'Espérance was born on April 25th, 1770, in Windsor, Ontario. Prior to marrying Jean-Baptiste, Catherine was married to Augustin François Theobald. They had married in October 1787 in Detroit. However, 2 years later, in 1789, Augustin had passed away. On April 13th, 1790, Jean-Baptiste married Catherine at St. Anne's Catholic Church in Detroit. It is the oldest Catholic church in Michigan and believed to be the second oldest continuously operating Roman Catholic parish in the United States. Following their wedding, we believe the couple lived in Detroit. Jean-Baptiste had several land holdings, a house, and an apartment where he lived with Catherine and the children until around 1805. Together, John and Catherine had 9 children, 5 sons and 4 daughters, plus a daughter from Catherine's first marriage. And here we have the names of the children and the dates of their lives. As a successful businessman and farmer, Jean-Baptiste put in several claims for land in Wayne and Macomb counties. At the time, as Jim has already said, the area was known as Erin Township. His claims were successful, granted and confirmed by the United States Commissioners and signed off by President James Madison. This is the land he successfully claimed that we know of. So there was 101 acres in Detroit in June 1798, 220 acres in Grosse Pointe in April 1811, 114 acres in Macomb County in October 1811, and 270 acres in Macomb County in May 1812. It is not known how he funded the purchase of this land. This is a map of Erin Township from 1859. We actually have a copy of the map if anybody would like to look at it after the presentation. And here is a copy of the Registry of Land for the 220 acres that Jean-Baptiste purchased in Grosse Pointe in April 1811, signed by President James Madison. Much of the land obtained by Jean-Baptiste was located where the intersection of Vernier Road and Lakeshore is located today. It is understood the type of property he desired was granted to farmers to provide them with access to the river, the most efficient route to and from markets. In general, the plots were long, narrow ribbon farms, up to 600 feet wide, that ran from the lake several miles inland. In total, the original Vernier estate was comprised of around 600 acres. It was originally known as the Le Decour Farm. The estate, aside from being used for agricultural purposes, was also the location of the family home, built by Jean-Baptiste in 1810. We actually traced the location of this house to Vernier Road, and it was number 665, and believe it or not, it was only raised probably about 5 years ago. It is reported the large square house was originally built of hewn logs, which rested on a foundation of stone. The walls were 3 feet thick. It was crowned with an old, steep French-style roof, from which a figure of the Saviour, 2 feet in length, chiselled out of pine, was bolted firmly to a central rafter. At each end of the house projected a squat chimney constructed of small bricks that were common on houses found on the continent. The upper story contained large bins that the Verniers used to store grain, while at the side of the house was a trapdoor and a secret cellar.
What was in the secret cellar?
Well, we don't know. It's a secret. After spending many years together, Catherine Vernier passed in Grosse Pointe on August 21st, 1831, aged 61. 3 years later, Jean-Baptiste passed on January 29th, 1834. When Jean-Baptiste and Catherine died, given that Grosse Pointe was without a dedicated cemetery for the parish, it is assumed they were laid to rest on the expansive Vernier farm. Jean-Baptiste had accumulated great wealth during his life and had given each of his children some land. Upon his death, the homestead was passed to his youngest son, Lawrence Robert, who lived there with his wife, Charlotte Tremblay Vernier, for the rest of their lives. In 1879, it is acknowledged the 600 acres of farmland once owned by the Vernier family had started to be reduced in size, presumably subdivided and sold. By 1953, the remaining 35 acres of the Vernier estate was sold at public auction. This is a map from 1893 of the Vernier land. The areas of the black solid key line indicate the Vernier farms. The long line of Verniers of Grosse Pointe are representatives of one of the oldest families in southeastern Michigan, and over the years there have been several notable family members, including Edmund C. Vernier, who was born February 16th, 1867. He was a restaurateur and a pillar of the community. In 1895, Edmund purchased a roadhouse from his cousin, John Vernier IV, who was Jean-Baptiste's grandson, who had opened the establishment at the foot of the Vernier property in 1888. Edmund utilised the establishment as a hotel, as well as a roadhouse, where it is said considerable gambling took place. He then bought a more prestigious place on Lakeshore, just south of Vernier Road. It is reported the inn was known for the hospitality of its host, and was one of the more popular summer resorts of the 1890s. The establishment was also noted for serving chicken, fish, and frog leg dinners. Edmund specialised in fish. He had his own fishing net, and it is said he caught fish on a daily basis. The inn was also popular with iceboat crews, Detroiters, and with the growing number of Grosse Pointe's summer resort community. And here is a picture of the roadhouse. Thank you very much, Susie Birschbach and her book, for finding this image. Susie is here tonight. Aside from owning the roadhouse, Edmund was a pillar of the community. After the village of Lockmore was incorporated in January 1927, Edmund became one of the first officers of the village. He held the position of president, after which he served as township clerk, treasurer, and supervisor for many years. While serving as president, he conceived the idea of a police radio station for Grosse Pointe Township, and along with several colleagues, they appeared before the Federal Radio Commission in Washington in July in 1930 to obtain a permit and station license to operate station WRDR. Edmund C. Vernier passed in September 1934. Another notable family member was William Gilbert Harris, who was born January 2nd, 1871. His parents were Joseph Wood Harris and Catherine Vernier Harris. Catherine was the daughter of Lawrence Vernier, who was Jean-Baptiste's youngest son. In 1880, Joseph and Catherine built a new home for the family, which is still in existence today, 755 Lakeshore. William Harris was a successful businessman. He owned a grocery store on part of the Vernier property, which was located opposite the home his parents had built. The store stocked hardware and farming implements. He was also the second postmaster of Clairview in Grosse Pointe, and he owned a second grocery store in Detroit. In 1895, William Harris married Mary Louise Connor at St. Paul's Church. It is alleged they were the last couple wedded in the church before it was torn down to make way for the new church that we know today. On June 10, 1913, William Harris suffered a fatal heart attack while attending a village meeting. During the early 1930s, 755 Lakeshore was located on a 29-acre lot. William's wife, Mary, still resided at the home along with their two children. As I said, the house still exists today. However, it has undergone multiple changes and the lot size has been significantly reduced. And this is 755 Lakeshore today. There are several other notable family members. Mostly they were high-flying politicians who served at local and state level. And today, only a handful of Verniers still reside in the area. And Jim, you have an interesting story about an electric car.
The electric car, well, I was going to have Marcia ask me that question.
Oh, okay, we can save it.
Marcia, where's Marcia?
Yes.
Please ask the question.
Yes. So what is the Vernier family connection with electric cars?
Oh, I'm glad you brought that up. In fact, today we were at the Henry Ford Museum in the Greenfield Village with our stone carver, Mr. David Gillespie, and his wife Renee, and we were speaking about the great history of the family. And as many of you know, electric cars are not new. In fact, Henry Ford's wife drove an electric car in 1903 and found to be fine for riding around town. They're very quiet, which we all know as we go about and you see your Teslas and this, that, and whatever. But as Marcia asked the question, she writes for St. Paul's on the Lake. She's the historian, the archivist, and does a fabulous job, and I love reading her historical stuff. But Father Nacy, I think it was, N-A-C-Y, told the congregation in writing in 1908 in July about the passing of a young Vernier. This will break your heart. She was 2 years old, and you're thinking to yourself, how did she die? How could a 2-year-old die? And what would that have to do with an electric car? Well, unbeknownst, she was run over by an electric car, and she died in he said it in August, she died in July of 1907. So that was really very, very interesting how that happened. Of course, Father Nacy was concerned at that time because they had just built a beautiful garage for all the horses and the trailers and all the different animals that would come that would bring people to St. Paul's on the Lake. And now he complained that he would have to make room for vehicles, whether electric or gas or whatever.
So let's move on to part 2, which is the history of St. Paul's Church and Cemetery. At the beginning of the 19th century, Grosse Pointe was part of St. Anne's Parish. Priests from various parts of Europe had arrived in the area to serve the needs of the growing Catholic population in Michigan. At the time, there was no chapel in Grosse Pointe, and it was without a dedicated cemetery. Between 1819 and 1825, there was a makeshift chapel located on the spacious farm owned by Pierre Provençal. This was also where the early settlers gathered on Sundays to pray. The Provençal farm adjoined Lake Sinclair and was about a mile south of another large plot of land, which was the location of the Reno farm, located just beyond Vernier Road. It has been reported that aside from the Provençal home, there was no church or chapel for many miles around. In 1825, the first church in Grosse Pointe was constructed. It was a small log chapel located on the Reno farm. Mass was offered at the chapel once a month, and it is alleged the roads of that day were so muddy that the parishioners would walk to church barefooted, carrying their shoes in their hands. It is estimated at the time only between 200 and 500 people lived in Grosse Pointe. In 1833, Reverend Boheme was appointed as the first permanent pastor of the chapel. And in 1835, the parish of St. Paul's was officially organised. In 1846, the parish register was established. Then, in February 1847, a site for a larger wood-framed church was selected and purchased, with space for a cemetery. The address was 157 Lakeshore, where St. Paul's is located today. In 1848, with the site of the new church secured, the original log chapel on the Reno farm was abandoned. After the new church was built, the land at the rear of the site was used for the cemetery. It is believed Jean-Baptiste and Catherine were moved from the burial sites in the Vernier farm to this new location. During the mid-1850s, it was decided St. Paul's Church needed to be increased in size once more. However, in order to expand, the space where the cemetery was located was required. In 1868, St. Paul's acquired a new plot of land for the cemetery, which was a 1.86-acre site located at Moross and Country Club Drive in Grosse Pointe Farms. It is acknowledged Father de Bru purchased the new plot for $425, which is around $9,000 today, from the Moross family. The land where the original cemetery was located then became part of the plot for the new St. Paul's Church, dedicated on October 15th, 1899, again the church we know today. The new cemetery on Moross became the final resting place for members of some of the earliest French families to inhabit Grosse Pointe, including the Moross, Renault, Kirby, Beaufait, Rivard, Morin, Cadieux, and the Reno families. In 1900, according to official Grosse Pointe documents, only 1,160 people lived in the community. So we have some numbers for you. 168 is the original number of burial plots in the cemetery. 37 is the number of Vernier family's members buried in the cemetery. And 500 is the number of plots believed to be in the cemetery today. And here are some of the Vernier headstones that can be found in the cemetery. The cemetery was originally divided into 4 sections. As you'll see on the photo, it was bisected by 2 roadways. It was reported individual plots were originally sold for about $10 each, and many families buying space where the graves could be clustered around a central monument. It appears many of the graves were located throughout the cemetery in different locations, with no real defined space for each family. It has been suggested the scattered arrangement was due to the intermarriages among the older families, with one cluster of names appearing in the groupings of another. Most of the graves are marked by crosses and carved headstones, mostly under 6 feet tall, as opposed to large monuments and mausoleums. And here are just a few of the headstones that can be found in the cemetery today. If you have the time, I would suggest walking around the cemetery. It is quite fascinating and truly beautiful. Once the new cemetery on Moros was established, Jean and Catherine Vernier were moved once again to their new plots. Possibly the oldest grave in the cemetery is that of Catherine Vernier. These are Jean-Baptiste and Catherine's original headstones that were erected in the cemetery. It should be noted that when Jean-Baptiste was buried, his name had been changed to John, presumably to anglicize it. The stones have remained in place for at least 150 years. Also located in the cemetery is Father Elson, a Dutchman who was instrumental in the construction of the new St. Paul's Church. Father Elson passed January the 4th, 1899, during the period of the church's final stages of construction. In dedication of his life and work, the congregation gave him the honour of making his funeral the first service to be held at the church, held in the unfinished building on January the 7th, 1899. The finished church was then dedicated 10 months later on October 15th, 1899. Father Elson was buried in St. Paul's Cemetery. His grave was originally marked with a wooden cross encircled by a white fence with an elm tree in proximity. It is believed he is the only known priest to be buried in the cemetery, and this is his stone today. Today, St. Paul's Cemetery is one piece of land without being divided by 2 roadways. It is situated behind a black metal fence that frames the site and remains the only cemetery in Grosse Pointe. There have been just a handful of burials in recent years. The last, it is believed, was in 2005. Records of the burials have been traced from handwritten notes and the church death book with its Latin entries to collate a map of who is buried in the cemetery and where. Sadly, due to extreme weather conditions, many of the headstones are cracked, faded, with the text barely visible. This included the headstones of Jean-Baptiste and Catherine Vernier. The headstones in the cemetery are a lasting reminder of the community's French heritage and the origins of the iconic street names that are now familiar in Grosse Pointe today. In 1984, St. Paul's Cemetery celebrated its 100-year anniversary. The cemetery was also one of the first recipients of the bronze historic plaque from the Grosse Pointe Historical Society. So let's move on to part 3, the final resting place, and I will hand you over to Jim Verney.
Thank you. The last 3 years have been very, very interesting years, and as I shared with some of you, you know that I did not know my name was Vernier until last 3 years ago. And our name was Verney, and I knew my father was French, and I knew my grandfather was in Bay City as a Verney, but we never knew the connection to Vernier. Why that was, I don't know. Both my parents are deceased, so God knows why that didn't happen. But through the grace of God, we're able to be together, and I know the roots of my family. And that's what I'd like to share with you in the next few minutes. My interest began in gravestones many years ago. And as some of you may have read Jody McVeigh's wonderful story in the Grosse Pointe News on, I think it was Thursday, August 10th. She did a wonderful job. We were putting in the new gravestones into the cemetery, and she followed me around the cemetery and asked questions, and did my best to answer them. And she got 99% of that story right if you read it in the Grosse Pointe News. It was very good. But the first part of the story that was in the Grosse Pointe News, can we go to the next one? The first one there is, how did my interest in gravestones begin? And the answer was back in Vermont when I was a child. My mother is from Connecticut, and we vacationed in Vermont, Massachusetts, and Connecticut from age 1 to age 18. I'd be up there 6 weeks when I was younger, 2 weeks when I was older, because as you get older, then you've got things like jobs and sports and this and that and whatever. But spent a lot of time in Vermont. One of our family traditions was to go on the many wonderful back roads of Vermont and go to these old cemeteries. And we play a little game in our family. And the game was really simple, because we knew at the end of the trip we were going to come away with some ice cream. But the challenge we had among the four of us was to find the oldest gravestone in the Vermont cemetery. You know, in areas north of Brattleboro, if you're familiar with Brattleboro, or north of Bennington or south of Manchester, those areas there's a plethora of family and city and regional cemeteries. And so we had fun. And we get out of the car, and of course Tom and I were real young, and we'd run around calling out the name of the oldest gravestone. And so, as the story goes, as was printed in the Grosse Pointe News, that whoever had the oldest gravestone got not one scoop of ice cream from Mackenzie's Ice Cream, which is a little bit like Sanders, but got 2 scoops. And of course, some of my friends say that it looks like I've had 3 scoops more than once. So I say that's one reason why I need to stay at 200 pounds. The second story is an interesting one, and my second cousin is here tonight, Tom Mahoney, and this was a surprise. And let me spend 3.5 minutes telling this particular story. 2015, I'm a restaurant guy and part of a group, and we sold a group of our restaurants in 2015, and so I didn't have to spend time in and day out operations and making sure the restaurants were rolling. We had some young guys that were taking care of that for us. So I had more time on my hands. So in 2015, I was convinced my parents to move from Holly, Michigan to Charlotte, where we live today, because they were in their late 80s, and it was important to keep an eye on them because they're getting a little crazy. And as I probably will, but well, I'm crazy now, I guess. But anyhow, my grandparents are buried in Mount Olivet Cemetery, as you know, it's at 6 Mile and Van Dyke. So in 2016, I went there, and as some of you know, I pray the rosary daily. And I went to the gravesite and I prayed the rosary for them on that day. Went back to North Carolina, fat, dumb, and happy, and came back a year later to say a rosary again. And I did that But then I went to the office and I said to the office, I'd like to find the paperwork on this particular plot of land. And the lady was very gracious and she said, sure, Jim, here it is. And lo and behold, my great-great-grandfather bought the plot in 1903 for $50. And it was space enough in there for nine people to be buried there. So, okay, that's cool. My grandfather and grandmother are buried there. I saw their stones, flat stones. And lo and behold, on that document, uh-oh. Sorry, David, am I okay? I think so. All right. My big surprise was that there were 7 people buried in that plot. So if you're doing the mathematics on it, two identified, 5 non-identified. So there was a need. So I went to Inch Monuments in Northville, Michigan, and I got 7 gravestones coming out of the ground, 2 feet gravestones for each of the 7 people that are buried there, which turned out to be my great-grandparents were so poor, they didn't even have their own gravestones there. But they paid for, the great-grandfather paid for it for $50 because my great-great-grandmother Eliza died, as Mary knows, at age 36. And so that was a surprise. So it was my grandmother and grandfather, my great-grandmother, my great-grandfather, which the great-grandfather was the one who changed his name from Vernier to Verney, and he was buried there. And I said, well, who are the other 3 people? Well, it was my grandfather's sister, Lucy, and her husband, Joe Doelle. And they had a 7th person there that I didn't know, a Miss Mahoney. I said, who is Miss Mahoney? And through some research, and that's how I got to meet Tom, who's my second cousin, that was Lucy and Mr. Dooley's child. So I found all 7 identified and bought gravestones for them. And so that project has given me some background in that. So that brings us up to today, St. Paul's on the Lake Cemetery. There's a woman here in this very audience, a friend of mine from Bay County. I joined, as I said, we had sold our restaurants. I had some time on my hand. I was interested in genealogy. I joined the Bay County Genealogy Society, and Mary McMahon Mann and I got to be good friends. And I sent her a copy that I found out of my parents' file, 1982 biography, not 1992, 1892 biography done by a Chicago company on great citizens of Bay City. And of course, Elizabeth Bourne's family, the Tremblays, were all over that particular document. But we also had a document that took care of my family and explained in great detail my family. And I gave that to Mary, and she did some additional work on that for me as a researcher at the beautiful Wirt Library in Bay City, if you're ever up there. And she contacted me in North Carolina. She said, Jim, you better get to Grosse Pointe. And I said, why is that? And she says, well, you have some family members that are buried at St. Paul's on the Lake. So the next time up in 2017, I came and I walked the cemetery by myself. And as Katie had said so nicely, I mean, it's a beautiful little cemetery and it's a great place for solitude and for prayer, and nice to walk around and pay your respects to the people that are buried there that came before us. And lo and behold, when I walked through that cemetery in 2017, there were not just Catherine and John Baptiste, but there were, as Katie said earlier, 37 Verniers that are there, Verniers. And so it's been fun sort of tracking down who's connected to who, and some of you in the audience there are connected to one arm of the family or the other arm of the family. So that's been pretty good. So here we go with some of the people that helped me in this project. And of course, Mary McMahon Mann, who I identified, she came down with Madam President, Kathleen Dorr, that came down from Bay City to join us tonight. Teresa Summer from St. Paul's on the Lake, together with Joe Smith, the sexton. What was really interesting, after my walk through the cemetery, is I called Teresa and I said, my great-great-grandparents, 6 generations back, the gravestone has fallen apart. And what can we do? And she said, Jim, it's sort of good news and bad news. And I said, well, what's that? And she said, the good news is we have a sexton, Joe Smith, been here for a long time, takes care of the grass and the weeds and the fences and the trees and this and that and whatever, but not the gravestones. And as most of you know, I did not know, but as most of you know, the family is responsible for the gravestones. So she said, if you want to replace those gravestones, then you can go ahead and do that. You have the permission of St. Paul's on the Lake. So I've been working, Teresa's one of my good friends that I've been working with for the last 3 years. Joe Smith did the hard work, which we'll show you in just a minute. Of course, my associate here, Katie, Katie and I've got to be good friends, and I read with great joy a lot of her documents that were on different blogs. And of course, she writes for the real estate firm, Maxon, Higbee, and Agnew. And I read a number of the stories about, she writes about the houses, you know, the big houses that bought the land from us many, many years ago that have great heritage. So I do want to thank Katie publicly for the wonderful job that she's done working with this fat bald guy from North Carolina. And then Leslie Wagner, of course, we've got to be good friends over the last few years, the immediate past president. And she's the leader on the project across the street. And of course, as you know, we're trying to raise some money to continue to make that a wonderful historical building for our current generations, but for generations to come. And the original gravestones for Catherine and John Baptiste are located very prominently across the street, and they're in a garden that's being developed, as Katie said, with Candy and Leslie in terms of a French garden. I don't know the name. Where's Leslie? How do we say it? All right, that's it. That's what a potager garden we're going to have across the street. And I don't know when we're going to have it finished by, but we're going to work on that project and get that accomplished. The next person that helped me in this quest was a lady that has a funny name, Perky Bissell. Perky Bissell. What do you think is a Perky Bissell? Anyhow, she's at Stephen F. Austin University in Nacogdoches, Texas. And she's the vice president of the Association for Gravestone Studies out of Greenfield, Massachusetts. And so I traveled with her and 22 other gravestone nerds, and we went to 16 different cemeteries in East Texas last February and got to know about cemeteries. And it's important that I communicate to you that cemeteries are not just for the dead. They're for the living, but they're for our history and they're for our culture. And in traveling in East Texas with Perky and the rest of the group, we found out about all the different cultures that have cemeteries and how they handle burials, and incredibly fascinating. We have with us tonight, as I shared earlier, Mr. David Gillespie, who did this wonderful gravestone by hand. There's no machine that did the gravestone. He did it by hand at his house, his studio, in, yes, this is right, Pumpkin Town, South Carolina. He and his wife Renee have, he and his wife Renee have an interesting company called Pumpkin Town Primitives, and they specialize in 1700s and 1800s, not only the gravestones, but the apparel and the history, especially in Charleston and those areas, and have done a great job. So David and Renee are with us. They joined with us at the Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village. Being a restaurant guy, I wanted to go to Eagle Tavern. I went to Eagle Tavern today and had a nice meal and enjoyed the food there. And of course, last but not least is the love of my life, my sounding board, my devil's advocate, my loving spouse for 48 years. So Karen has been with me and I bounce all these ideas off of her. And as you can tell by my personality, I am pretty hard to live with, and so I do appreciate her patience and being with me. So a couple other people I'd like to recognize while I'm here. Of course, Jody McVeigh, who wrote the article for us on the Grosse Pointe, in the Grosse Pointe News. I became a member of the French-Canadian Society of Michigan, and that is a wonderful organization. I've learned so much about our culture, and I continue to learn. I hope that I will stay curious the rest of my life. I hope that at 71 I can continue to learn all the way up to age 100. Then I will pass the baton to somebody else. Grosse Pointe Historical Society we've talked about. Marcia's here representing St. Paul's on the Lake, archivist. If you get a chance, go on the website for St. Paul's and read the history. It's just fascinating, the work that she's done. And of course, the library has wonderful history that should be read by each and every one of us to learn about this wonderful community that we're a part of. I also want to recognize my classmate from Catholic Central, Don Greenwell. And Don Greenwell spent Monday, July 24th with us as the gravestones were pulled out, the old ones, and replaced with the new gravestones. But Don's genius was when, when Sexton pulled out the gravestone, there happened to be the end of a medicine bottle that was in the grave. It was in the grave. And the medicine bottle, Don, correct me if I'm wrong, was like 1865?
Yep.
Would that be right?
Yep.
And what kind of medicine was it?
Mrs. Smith's magic elixir or something.
So whoever put the gravestones in there had a sense of humor. We didn't find any beer bottles or any bourbon or anything like that, but anyhow, the technology was so cool because Don was over there, bum 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 bum. Said, Jim, I know what it is, and what he told you, it was an elixir. So you never know what's going to be in there.
Mostly alcohol and some derivative of cocaine.
Right. I wonder if that had helped anybody get to that cemetery by having that particular medicine. And last, I wanted to thank my friends at St. Anne's de Detroit. As you know, that Catherine and John Baptiste were married there in 1790, but I have a plethora of relatives, either Cassay or St. Albans or Verniers, or on my grandmother Verney's side, the Patton family, births, deaths, baptisms, all that. So I have a strong connection that I didn't know that I had to my other friend from grade school, Bob Weiner, who is here tonight. And Bob and I go back to St. Michael's of Livonia back in first grade. And Bob is a docent at St. Anne's de Detroit, and he's part of the St. Gabriel Richard History Society. And as you know, we're trying to put together a package for Rome so they would look to St. Gabriel, Father Gabriel Richard to be a saint at some point. So that's a project we're working on. Of course, Bob's much closer to it than I am. And last but not least, Elizabeth Bourne, who through the Cassays and the Tremblays and the St. Albans and the Verniers, we figured out, I guess probably Elizabeth, maybe 5 years ago, that we were related probably 8 generations back. And so we've been friends. And of course, she does such wonderful work with John Cooper on French history and society. All right, we're going to pick up the pace here. Here we go. There's David Gillespie. There's some of the work that he does. And as you, again, he does it by hand. He does 1 stone a month. And because of 2 people, he did ours in November, December, and January, February of this past year. But he does it by hand. And lo and behold, ladies and gentlemen, he allowed me to even try it with the chisel and the mallet and pound up against it. And he didn't let me go too far. And of course, I got tired out real fast, so he quickly took the mallet out of my hand. He didn't want to screw up the work. Okay? This is the work that you'll see in the St. Paul's on the Lake Cemetery. These are done in slate. Why are they done in slate as opposed to granite or sandstone or some of the other materials? David convinced me that he said, Jim, look at gravestones from England, Ireland, and Scotland, and there you will see ancient gravestones carved in slate that are still readable 300 years. And so our dream, our hope is that 300 years from now, ancestors of ours will be able to read these gravestones and understand the connection. David, could you tell us about your money-back guarantee, please?
My guarantee is I always tell clients when I finish a stone that if these stones should last 400 years, and if they don't, just bring them back.
That's the Pumpkin Town, South Carolina. Okay, David Gillespie, by the way. And look at I guess the other point that's important is that we had, how did he do that based on the old stones? And so I want to show you what I did for David and for obviously ourselves. I'm very poor at art and drawing. And so I went out to the cemetery on a cloudy, rainy day, much like today. And I taped this to the gravestone and I rubbed a red crayon, obviously, and was able to duplicate this for John Baptiste and for Catherine. And so I rolled it up and brought it home to Charlotte and then on to David and Renee's house. And from that, he was able to carve exactly like the original. And be able to take, as he said at lunch today, he said, you know, the fat letters are the tough letters. And knowing how to do those. And it was his first experience with that. So it worked out pretty good. Please. You want to clap for that? Okay. The old gravestones are 200 pounds apiece. The new gravestones are 400 pounds apiece. So we had to crate those up in South Carolina and ship them to Grosse Pointe Farms to St. Paul's on the lake. And so you can see how that goes. And that's what was shipped back in February. And so in July 2023, like we said, on the 24th of July, we did our work. And so that's where we were at the start of the day. And you can see that Joe's team, there were, of course, I was doing what I do best. I was supervising the activity. And Joe's team, himself and 3 other guys did a yeoman's job digging in. And so no one's confused. The bodies were not touched. You know, we did nothing with the bones. We don't know, frankly, in what condition that they're in. You know, who knows? What we did do is take the stones out. So you can see, because they're so heavy, we had to be able to take it and be able to place them in very gently. And further work, you can see what's going on. And if you recall, that was right after your big storm here. Remember the big storm? And it knocked down that tree on Moross Road there and paralyzed that street for a while. I was up there during that time there, so that's why we had to postpone some of these activities. But here goes the stone. It's going in for placement. And then the final resting place. 2023, we're having the celebration of life, honoring, remembering, and celebrating the life of Jean Baptiste and Catherine Vernier. So with that, we'll give it to question and answers, or do you want to say something prior to question and answers?
No, go ahead.
All right. If there's any questions, we'd like to entertain them. You know, bear in mind, I mean, we're not professional historians. I mean, we're just common people that did some research and had a passion for it. So this is not a scholarly work. It will not be at U of M or Wayne State or anything like that. If we have any questions, Don?
So the last 35 acres of the farm that was sold in 1953, do you know where that is and what's there?
We do not. We do not, unfortunately. That was the last piece of land. It's interesting, it was sold at public auction in 1953. And of course, I was born in 52 and I didn't have any money, but if I would have known about it. But it's interesting how quickly, I guess when you have farm families like the Ribbon Farms, you know, they have 8, 9, 10, 11 children. And as the children had 8, 9, 10, 11 children, so then you have 100 descendants that are there, and they all get a piece of the land. In fact, in the records we have 1850, one of Charles's sons, not John Baptiste, he was John Vernier. He petitioned in the Detroit Free Press in 1853 for the right to sell 36 acres. As a minor, he wanted to cash in on it, and so you had the relatives that, as you know, the Grosse Pointe in the 1870s and 80s and 90s were becoming a vacation place, and so the land was more valuable at that time, and so they were going to cash in on it, and so they did. But no, I do not know unless Katie knows.
No,
where it
we
is.
never found that out, did we?
You know, Don, that's the next part of the research, is to go back to the land records and find out where it was and how much they sold it for and to who they sold it for. Obviously, nobody of this group owns any of it. Another question? Please.
My mother's maiden name is Vernier. That's how she pronounces it. And, yes. And her mother was a Tremblay. And in researching my grandmother's side, I noticed multiple spellings. There was Tremblay, Tremblay, Trombley, Trombley, and some just Ly. And I'm thinking it was probably because of the prejudice that got your name changed. But what was the basis of the prejudice? Was it religious? Was it against the French?
Remember I referred a little bit earlier in the presentation to the Lieutenant Governor of Detroit. It was the British settlement in 1775 to 1779. He was in charge of it. And so he was the one that did the population information that I gave you earlier. But then he wrote a piece on the French people. He said, French people, he was writing this to his superior in Montreal. He said, the French people are farmers. They're simple people. They're not very intelligent. Some of them are lazy. And they have no earthly idea what kind of economic value they have in that land. And so he said, oh, by the way, the ones that were traders, you know, that were working with the furs, you know, they were not to be trusted according to the documents that he wrote to his superior. You can't trust those French traders of furs. And oh, by the way, they'll get the Native American Indians in order to make the transition. So, you know, we had that kind of mentality. And I tell one other story on that, is that when I was at the John King Library last year, and I picked up a little book about when Michigan became a state in 1837. And I looked in the book and I wanted to see how many of our French ancestors were in that book. And guess what? We had one. Or we had two, rather. I take that back. Joseph Campo, which was a great merchant and a great landowner. Right. and of course, Father Gabriel Richard. Everybody else came over from New York when the Erie Canal and came over, and the British started it and the Americans started it, to make Michigan grow and be populated. And so again, we were, it just seems so strange in this day and age to say that we were second-class citizens, but we were looked at that way from my research. Any other questions? Yes, please, Mary.
How many generations back for you to John Baptiste?
As far as we know, 6. And there's a little part of the history sort of in between that gets a little fuzzy. I think there might have been some hanky-panky there in a couple of the generations that I can't quite track down.
And Charles that was in Bay City, was his father the Antoine?
Right, correct.
Not another one of the.
No,
John
not.
Baptiste.
We went back and forth whether it was a John Baptiste or it was Antoine. But in that document that I said, the biography of 1892, it says quite emphatically, my father was Antoine.
But I wondered if you found baptismal records for him.
Not yet. And of course, his wife,
The St. Aubin.
his wife was Delia St. Aubin.
Right.
And her father was Francois St. Aubin, who is big in Mount Clemens. In fact, John Baptiste was managed, I should say, or protected, what's the word, for about 3 or 4 years. He was raised, I guess, by Francois St. Aubin.
Maybe it was one of those situations where, their official name may have been one thing, but they used another common
Correct,
name,
yeah.
like a middle name, or I see that.
Yeah, could be. I mean, as Katie said in the beginning, it's really true. You start genealogy, you get it one question answered. Son of a gun, don't 3 or 4 more questions come up. I mean, the big one we talked about was capital. How in God's name do you get enough capital to have 800 acres of land? And then playing off of Don's question, who in the hell did they buy it from? Who did John Baptiste buy it from? And what price did he pay? So my feeling is that there probably was some money in France that came over to Montreal, St. Laurent, Montreal, and they had some money, and he got to take it and invest it down here. And John Baptiste, as some of you know, in one of the readings that we had, he owned land down by the what is now the tunnel between Detroit and Windsor. And that's where that house was that Katie was talking about earlier.
You talk about the president of the United States granting him ownership of the land, but if he owned it before, was it recorded in some way?
Well,
For the British or for the French?
that's a
That land translating through the different dynasties.
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a wonderful professor out of the University of Windsor, and Karen knows how to pronounce his name. Say it.
Guillaume Tisdale.
Guillaume Tisdale, Professor Guillaume Tisdale. Elizabeth said, she's my French Tisdale. Teasdale. He wrote a book that came out 3 years ago just about that topic, about land ownership in Detroit and Canada, Windsor, Amherstburg, that Sandwich, those areas over there, also had ribbon farms over there too. And so he talked about how it was handled during the French time. And then, of course, the French, as you know, were booted in 1763. And so the British were in from 1763. They were supposed to get out in when did the war end? Revolutionary War, 1781. They were supposed to get out in 1781, but they didn't get out of Detroit until 1796. It was sort of fun. But anyhow, Professor Teasdale has a wonderful, wonderful document on how the land was recorded first with the French. But to further your question, John Baptiste and a group of probably Tremblays and Campos and Cajous and people like that They petitioned the government in 1800, a Michigan petition to the U.S. government to ask for their claims to be recognized. And John Baptiste, how did he sign his name? Well, how do semi-literate people sign their name? That will be X. That will be X. And so that's how he did that. So we don't, of course it was great consternation because the British didn't want to recognize any of the French landholdings, but they had to do it begrudgingly. And they kept it in place, thank God, until the U.S. took over in 1795, 1796, sometime in that range. So landholdings are very, very interesting. And like I said, I need to do more research on that, especially on the houses. Like Katie said, Katie and I looked at this one house. What was the one? The 1810 house.
Yeah.
And we were talking about it, and it was on the market in
2013.
2013, but it was on for $75,000 bucks.
Yes.
And I said, "Oh my God, for $75,000 bucks, I mean, I'd get into the piggy bank if Karen said okay, and we'd buy that thing and get it restored and go from there." But it quickly
Then we found out it is no more, unfortunately.
there's no more. It was a knockdown, which happens far too often. Do we have time for one more question? And if not, we
I
thank.
was just gonna ask, what about, did you find a casket? Any caskets or bones, or did you just really stay around the stones?
We stayed around the stones. We found some additional stones there. We found parts of, 5 other stones, 7 in total, and we're trying to still find out who those stones belong to. That was sort of strange. So we found Don's elixir bottle, and then we found 5 other stones there. Yeah,
One more thing to add before we finish. I'd just like to thank you all for coming. And I'd like to thank Mr. Verney, who has been an absolute joy to work with, thoroughly entertaining and incredibly interesting. And we still have many questions we need to answer. So
the one question, and looking for Katie to be the writer and put this together, I said, who in Grosse Pointe Farms is in St. Clair Shores is a big Liverpool Football Club fan? And lo and behold, the only one that was around was Katie. And so Katie and I have a common interest in the Liverpool Football Club. Not an ownership, but just an interest.
just watching them play. Higby Maxinagny, as part of this presentation series, has another lecture coming up on November the 15th, which is going to be about the prominent Detroit architect, Robert O'Derrick, who did many, I can't even remember how many homes he did in Grosse Pointe, but it's over 20. It will be given by Paula Draper, who's at the back of the room, who did a fabulous presentation earlier this year on Hugh T. Keys. So we will be announcing that shortly. Again, that's November 15th. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have lots of lemonade and homemade cookies in the kitchen. Have some before you go. Don't forget our Halloween party on October 28th. And soon you can tour the Caju Farmhouse. So let us know at the Historical Society if you'd like to come by. Thanks again.
You're welcome.